Winter had always been my favorite season. There was something magical about the crisp, cold air, the way the snow blanketed the world in silence, and the warm glow of holiday lights that seemed to chase away the darkness. But for me, the true essence of winter was in the tradition I held dear, building the perfect snowman. Every December, I would spend hours crafting a snowman in my front yard. It wasn't just any snowman, it was a masterpiece. The year before, I had built a life-sized snow wizard, complete with an ice staff that sparkled in the sunlight. The year before that, it was a snowman in a top hat and scarf, looking like it had stepped out of a Victorian Christmas card. The neighborhood kids would stop by to take pictures, and even the adults would compliment my work. It was one of the few things that brought our little suburban community together. But this year, everything changed. This year, I had the misfortune of crossing paths with Margaret, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood. If you've never dealt with a Margaret before, let me explain. Margarets are a special breed of people. They thrive on control, power, and making others miserable. They live for petty complaints, pointless rules, and the illusion of authority. And Margaret? She was the queen bee of them all. Margaret had spent the past year terrorizing the neighborhood. She had issued fake fines for everything from excessive bird chirping to improperly painted fences. She had even demanded that one neighbor repaint their fence because it wasn't the approved shade of beige. But even I was caught off guard when, just one day after building my snowman, I woke up to find it completely destroyed. At first, I thought it might have been the wind or maybe some mischievous kids. But when I checked my security camera, there she was, Margaret, in all her glory. Dressed in her robe and slippers, she had waddled onto my lawn at 11:47 p.m., kicked the head off my snowman, ripped off its arms, and stomped the body flat. As if that wasn't enough, she pulled out a hairdryer from her pocket and blasted the remains with hot air. I watched the footage in shock, then disbelief, and finally, sheer rage. Who the hell does something like this? I stepped outside, hoping there might be some explanation, a misunderstanding, maybe even an emergency. But no, the only thing waiting for me was a printed letter stuck in my mailbox. Dear homeowner, as per the new HOA regulations, all unauthorized yard decorations must be removed within 24 hours. Failure to comply may result in fines. Signed, Margaret, HOA President. The problem? There was no HOA. Our neighborhood had voted against forming 1 year ago. But Margaret didn't like that answer. So, she had started running a fake HOA, collecting fees from unsuspecting new homeowners, sending out bogus violation letters, and generally making life miserable for anyone who didn't bow to her imaginary authority. And now, apparently, my snowman was her latest target. Oh, hell no. I wasn't going to let this slide. I rebuilt the snowman that same afternoon, taller, stronger, and with a few upgrades. I set up my security cameras for round 2, and sure enough, the next night, Margaret returned. This time, she brought a shovel. She wasn't just knocking the snowman down. She was digging it up like some deranged snow archaeologist, making sure there was no trace left behind. And when she was done, another fake HOA letter appeared in my mailbox. At that point, I knew this wasn't just about the snowman. This was personal. And if Margaret wanted a war, she was about to get one. The next morning, I woke up to a scene straight out of a sitcom, except instead of laughter, I was boiling with rage. Not only had my snowman been destroyed again, but now there was a bright orange notice duct taped to my front door. Violation warning. You are in breach of HOA regulations regarding unauthorized yard obstructions. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. Signed, Margaret, HOA President. I yanked the paper off and crumpled it in my fist, but my anger only grew when I saw a second note taped to my mailbox and a third stapled to my wooden fence. Margaret wasn't playing around. She wanted to make damn sure I got the message. Now, I could have ignored it. Most sane people would. After all, Margaret's fake HOA had no legal power. But the problem was, Margaret was a master manipulator. She knew that if she acted like an authority figure long enough, people would start to believe her. And in our quiet little neighborhood, she had been playing the long game. Some of my newer neighbors, people who had moved in within the last couple of years, actually thought she was the HOA president. She printed official-looking paperwork, used legal jargon, and even had a fake HOA email address. I had heard rumors that she was collecting monthly dues from some residents who didn't know better. But now, she was trying to pull that scam on me. And for what? Because she didn't like my snowman? Because she wanted to flex some non-existent power? That wasn't happening. I took all 3 copies of her fake warning and marched straight to her house. She lived 2 streets over in a home that was, of course, plastered with HOA signs and notices. I rang the doorbell, crossed my arms, and waited. The door swung open so fast I thought she'd been waiting for me. And there she was, Margaret, in her full glory, bathrobe, slippers, and a steaming mug that said HOA Queen in gold lettering. "I knew you'd show up," she said smugly, sipping her coffee. I was wondering how long it would take. I held up the notices. "You want to explain this?" She glanced at them like they were an unimportant grocery receipt. "Oh, that? Yes, those are legally binding violation notices. You have 24 hours to comply." I actually laughed. "Legally binding? Margaret, we don't have an HOA." Her smile didn't even falter. "That's where you're wrong," she said, tilting her head in a condescending way. "The HOA exists whether you like it or not. It was formed after you moved in." I narrowed my eyes. "I've lived here for 10 years. I was at the meeting where we voted against forming an HOA." She took another sip of her coffee. "And I was at the meeting where we reconsidered." I clenched my jaw. "Who exactly voted?" She waved a hand vaguely. "That's not important. The point is—" "No, it is important," I said, stepping closer. "Because as far as I know, the only people in this HOA are you and maybe 3 of your miserable friends." That seemed to get under her skin. Her fake politeness cracked just a little. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "you can disagree all you want, but the fact remains. You are in violation, and there will be consequences." I took a slow breath through my nose. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that this HOA was real. What exactly am I violating?" She smirked. "Excessive yard decorations." I blinked. "It's a snowman." "Yes," she said, nodding like I was finally catching on. "A yard decoration in winter." "Yes. And in a state that gets snow." "Yes." She repeated it like she was talking to a child. "And I'm afraid it disrupts the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. The rules state that all holiday decorations must be tasteful and temporary." I stared at her. "It's literally made of snow. It is temporary." "That's not the point," she snapped. "The point is that it's an eyesore, and if you don't remove it, you'll be fined $75 per day until it's gone." That's when I lost it. I started laughing. Really laughing. The kind of laugh that makes your stomach hurt. Margaret just stood there, frowning like I had personally offended her. "This is hilarious," I said, wiping my eyes. "Margaret, you do not have the power to fine me. Your HOA is fake, and even if it wasn't, you can't fine people for snowmen." She scoffed. "I can actually. And I will. You'll be receiving an invoice shortly." And with that, she slammed the door in my face. I walked home, shaking my head. This woman was delusional. I had dealt with her nonsense before, her fake parking rules, her mandatory lawn inspections. But this was a new level of crazy. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't just being a petty tyrant. She was trying to scare me. Margaret thrived on control. She didn't actually expect me to pay her bogus fine. She just wanted me to comply, to submit, to accept that she had power over me. That wasn't happening. I sat down at my computer and did 2 things. First, I printed out every legal document proving that our neighborhood had no legally recognized HOA. Second, I filed a report with the city for fraudulent fines. Because if Margaret wanted to play dirty, I'd show her just how much dirt I could dig up. But before any of that, I had one very important task. I needed to rebuild my snowman. Only this time, I was going to make sure it was Margaret-proof. I spent the rest of the afternoon in full-blown battle mode, not just against Margaret, but against the very idea that she thought she could control people with her fake rules and manufactured authority. My snowman wasn't just a snowman anymore. It was a symbol, a testament to standing up to HOA tyranny, a frozen middle finger aimed directly at Margaret's power trip. This time, it wasn't going anywhere. I started by gathering supplies. First stop, the local hardware store. I needed something solid, something that wouldn't just collapse under a shove or a hairdryer. That's when I spotted it, a steel drum. Big, heavy, indestructible. The perfect core. I bought it on the spot, along with a bag of quick-ready cement. Because if Margaret wanted to escalate, I was going to meet her at the top of the crazy ladder. Back at home, I got to work. Step 1. I filled the steel drum with a mixture of water and cement, letting it set into a solid, frozen block. That alone would have been enough to stop any more attacks. But I wasn't done. Step 2. I packed ice and compacted snow around the barrel, shaping it into a realistic snowman frame. I sculpted the details, smoothed out the surface, and even added a little extra powdery snow to make it look completely innocent. The end result? A perfect snowman, except for the fact that, under its cute, fluffy exterior, it was now a 300-pound, cement-filled, Margaret-proof monolith. But I wasn't finished. Margaret didn't just push my last 2 snowmen. She had escalated to shoveling and hair drying. I needed defenses. So, I took it a step further. First, I sprayed the outermost layer with water, letting it freeze into a slick, near-invisible ice shell. That way, if she tried to push it over, she'd get nothing but frostbitten hands. Then, just for extra security, I placed a discreet metal pole for back support, securing it deep into the ground. And then, the finishing touch, a little surprise, just in case she got bold. You see, Margaret had one favorite tactic when she really wanted to be vindictive. She'd use her SUV. I had seen her do it before, using her front bumper to gently encourage things she didn't like. Stray trash cans, an old mailbox, and once, a neighborhood kid's bike that was left too close to the sidewalk. She never hit anything hard, just enough to make sure it fell over, just enough that she could play innocent. I was betting that if I rebuilt the snowman big enough, bold enough, and obvious enough, she would take the bait. So, for one final touch, I placed a few strategic bricks inside the base. Nothing visible, just enough to make sure that if she rammed it, she was in for one hell of a surprise. I stepped back and admired my work. From the street, it looked perfect, no different from any other harmless holiday decoration. Just another neighborhood snowman. But beneath the surface, it was a fortress. I set up my security cameras, made myself a hot chocolate, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Just as the sun set, Margaret's SUV came creeping down the street. I could see her silhouette in the driver's seat, slowing down as she reached my house. The headlights flooded my lawn. She saw the snowman. I saw her foot tap the brakes. I could practically hear her seething. She had spent the past 3 days trying to destroy this thing, and now, here it was, rebuilt, stronger, bigger than before. She probably thought I was mocking her. I was. For a moment, I thought she might actually leave it alone. But then, she pulled into my driveway. Oh, here we go. I watched from my window as she stepped out of the car, armed with a brand new shovel. She stomped toward my yard, gripping the handle like she was about to execute some kind of righteous crusade against frozen happiness. The queen of the fake HOA was about to deliver justice. She lifted the shovel. She swung. Clang. I had to bite my tongue to stop from laughing as the impact vibrated through her arms. The shovel bounced off the solid core like she had just tried to hack at a street pole. Margaret stumbled back, shaking her hands, clearly realizing that something was very, very wrong. But she wasn't done. She leaned in, inspecting the snowman closely. Maybe she noticed the ice layer. Maybe she felt the resistance when she tried to jab it. Either way, she took a step back, pulled out her phone, and made a call. A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable rumble of an engine. She was bringing in reinforcements. And by reinforcements, I mean herself, in her SUV. I watched as she got back into the driver's seat, shifted into reverse, and positioned her vehicle directly in front of the snowman. I almost couldn't believe it. She was actually going to ram it. She revved the engine. She hesitated. Then, she floored it. The instant impact was glorious. Her front bumper crunched inward like an accordion. The hood crumpled. The headlights flickered. And the unmistakable sound of a radiator exploding echoed through the street. Steam billowed from under the hood as her brand-new luxury SUV died on impact. And the snowman? It didn't even budge. I wish I could describe the expression on Margaret's face. Shock, horror, absolute disbelief. Like she had just discovered that the laws of physics were personally out to get her. She stumbled out of the car, staring at the damage. I stepped outside, leaning casually against my door frame, sipping my hot chocolate. Something wrong. I called out. She spun to face me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You. she stammered, her fingers shaking at the perfectly intact snowman. I took another sip of cocoa. I don't know what to tell you, Margaret. It's just snow. I could see the steam coming out of her ears. Then, just when I thought the night couldn't get any better, the police arrived. For a few glorious seconds, Margaret just stood there, staring at her ruined SUV like the universe had personally betrayed her. The steam from the busted radiator rose into the cold night air, mingling with the sheer rage radiating off her. I took another slow sip of my hot chocolate, savoring the moment like a fine wine. Then, just when I thought the night couldn't get any better, the sound of sirens cut through the cold air. I glanced down the street, and sure enough, 2 squad cars were rolling up, red and blue lights flashing against the snowy backdrop. My security cameras had captured everything, and I had made sure to send a little tip to the local authorities just before she committed vehicular manslaughter against the snowman. I hadn't expected them to show up this fast, but honestly, this was even better than I had planned. Margaret turned toward the approaching police cars, her face cycling through every possible emotion in the Margaret playbook: shock, rage, indignation, denial. She whirled back to me, her expression twisted with fury. "You called the police on me?" she shrieked. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused. "Margaret, I was inside drinking hot chocolate. You were the one who just rammed your car into my front yard. Maybe someone else called them." She opened her mouth to fire back, but then she noticed the cameras. Her eyes locked onto the very obvious security setup I had aimed at the yard. Her face went pale. That's when the first cop, Officer Mitchell, stepped out of his squad car and made his way over. He took one look at Margaret, then at the still smoking remains of her car, then at the completely untouched snowman. His expression was priceless. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered, rubbing his temple like he already had a headache. Margaret, sensing an opportunity, immediately switched to full fake victim mode. "Oh, thank God you're here, officer," she gasped, clutching at her chest like a woman in a soap opera. "I was viciously attacked by. She gestured wildly at my snowman, realizing too late that she was about to blame an inanimate object. Mitchell looked unimpressed. "Ma'am, did you just hit a snowman with your car?" Margaret spluttered. He trapped me." She pointed at me, her face twisting into a look of pure rage. "This man booby-trapped his property. He put concrete inside the snowman. That's illegal." Mitchell turned to me, his face stone-cold neutral. I smiled. "Officer, it's just a snowman." Mitchell sighed. "Why don't we start from the beginning? Sir, can you explain what happened?" I nodded, playing it completely straight-faced. "Of course. Every winter, I build a snowman in my front yard. It's a tradition. The past few nights, someone kept destroying it, so today I decided to build it sturdier. I used a barrel as a core so it wouldn't collapse so easily. But apparently, I gestured toward Margaret's car. Someone decided to ram it with an SUV. Mitchell pinched the bridge of his nose. "You're telling me she hit a barrel filled with snow and ice?" Margaret exploded. It was a trap. He knew I'd. She cut herself off too late. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Knew what exactly?" Margaret's mouth snapped shut so hard I thought she might break a tooth. The second cop, Officer Daniels, stepped forward, crossing his arms. "So, just to be clear, you, a grown woman, willingly drove your vehicle onto his private property, into his front yard, and crashed into a stationary object?" Margaret tried again. It was on the sidewalk." I pointed to the clear tire tracks leading directly into my yard. Daniels followed them with his eyes. "Ma'am, this snowman is a good 10 feet away from the sidewalk." Margaret's jaw clenched so hard I swore I heard her teeth crack. This isn't fair. He set me up." Mitchell sighed again, rubbing his eyes. "Okay, here's what's happening. First, you're being cited for reckless driving and destruction of property." Margaret's face twisted in horror. "What? I'm the victim here." Mitchell ignored her. "Second, since you deliberately drove onto private property, your insurance isn't going to cover the damages to your vehicle. That means you're financially responsible for your own repairs." Margaret shrieked. Daniels wasn't done. "Third, we've had multiple reports from residents about your fake HOA fines. We've forwarded those complaints to the city and are opening an investigation into fraudulent activity." I nearly choked on my hot chocolate. This was better than Christmas morning. Margaret, on the other hand, had lost the ability to form words. She just stood there, face twitching, eyes wide, completely out of excuses. Mitchell turned back to me. Sir, do you want to press charges for trespassing and property damage? I thought about it for a second, then smiled. You know what? I think Margaret's got enough legal trouble for one night. I'll settle for an official trespassing warning. Mitchell nodded. Fair enough. He turned to Margaret. Ma'am, you are officially trespassed from this property. If you step foot on this lawn again without permission, you will be arrested. Margaret looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. Mitchell handed her the citation and motioned toward her wrecked SUV. You'll need to call a tow truck for your vehicle. Have a good night. And just like that, the cops left. I stood there, basking in the afterglow of pure, unfiltered victory. Margaret, meanwhile, was still frozen in place, staring at the paperwork in her hands like it was a death sentence. Good talk, I said, patting the snowman. Oh, and Margaret? She snapped her head up, seething. I grinned. See you next winter. And with that, I turned around, walked inside, and closed the door. As soon as it clicked shut, I laughed so hard I nearly passed out. Outside, I heard her let out a frustrated scream before dialing for a tow truck. But it wasn't over yet. Because while Margaret had lost the battle tonight, she was about to lose the whole war. Margaret wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. Oh no, she was the type who would burn the whole village down just because she couldn't rule it. And sure enough, less than 24 hours after she turned her SUV into an automotive corpse against my snowman, I woke up to a new letter taped to my front door. But this one was special. At first glance, it looked like just another one of Margaret's phony HOA violation notices. But then I saw the bold red letters at the top. Mandatory Community Reimbursement Notice. Oh no. I ripped it open and started reading. According to Margaret's latest fantasy document, every household in the neighborhood was being charged a one-time emergency fee of $300. The reason? To cover the unexpected damages sustained by the HOA president's vehicle due to a community safety hazard. I had to sit down. I was laughing too hard to breathe. Margaret, this absolute lunatic, was trying to force the entire neighborhood to pay for the car she totaled against my snowman. The level of audacity was actually impressive. At the bottom of the letter, there was an official-looking demand for payment, with a deadline of 7 days and instructions to drop off cash or checks at her house. Oh, and of course, failure to comply would result in additional fines and HOA penalties. I couldn't take it. I had to show someone. So, I grabbed the letter and walked down the street to my neighbor, Mike. Mike had lived here even longer than I had. He was a retired Army vet, a no-nonsense kind of guy, and most importantly, he had zero patience for Margaret's nonsense. When I handed him the letter, he read it once, blinked, then read it again. Then he looked up at me, eyes wide. She actually thinks people are going to pay her, he asked. I grinned. Oh, she's not just thinking it. She's expecting it. Mike let out a long, slow whistle. This woman's got a bigger ego than my drill sergeant. I nodded. So what do we do? Mike thought for a moment. Then his face split into a mischievous grin. We let her dig her own grave. And that's exactly what we did. Instead of immediately exposing her, we let the letter spread. See, Margaret thought she had control over the neighborhood, but what she didn't realize was that people were already sick of her. So, the moment dozens of families got this ridiculous demand for money, the entire community turned against her. People started calling each other, whispering at mailboxes, sharing copies of the letter in the local Facebook group. By the next morning, the entire street was buzzing. And Margaret? She was completely oblivious. She actually went door to door that afternoon, reminding people about their mandatory payments. That was the moment we struck. Mike and I gathered as many neighbors as possible and walked right up to Margaret's house, all at once. She opened the door, smug as ever, until she saw how many of us were standing there. Her face dropped. Mike, being the fearless legend he was, stepped forward and held up his copy of the letter. So, Margaret, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I just wanted to clarify something. She forced a smile. Oh, of course. The payments are due by next week, so... Mike interrupted. I was just wondering, which legal authority are you using to collect this money? Margaret blinked. Excuse me. Mike tilted his head, looking genuinely curious. Well, since you're demanding money from the entire community, I assume there's some kind of legal backing behind it, right? I mean, this isn't fraud, is it? Margaret visibly flinched at the word fraud. Oh, of course not. This is an HOA matter. Ah, Mike nodded. So then, you won't mind if we ask the city council to verify that your HOA is legally registered? At that exact moment, my neighbor Susan pulled out her phone. Oh, actually, I already did that this morning. Margaret's eyes snapped to her. Susan smiled sweetly. And guess what? There's no record of an HOA for this neighborhood. In fact, the city says they've received multiple complaints about fraudulent fines being issued under your name. Margaret's face went bone white. And that's when the first person ripped up their letter. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd started shredding her stupid fake invoices right in front of her. Margaret looked like she was going to implode. You can't just. Oh, but we can, Mike said cheerfully. And hey, speaking of legal matters, the city also said they're sending someone to open an investigation into your financial records. Margaret actually staggered. You can't do that. Susan beamed. Oh, honey, we didn't. The city did. And you can expect a visit from them real soon. That was it. That was the moment Margaret broke. She let out this inhuman screech, slammed the door in our faces, and vanished inside. Less than 2 hours later, the Facebook group got an update. Margaret had officially resigned as HOA president of an HOA that never existed. But it wasn't over. Because while Margaret was licking her wounds, the legal consequences were just beginning. And this time, she couldn't fake her way out of them. For the next 3 days, the neighborhood buzzed like a live wire. Margaret had been publicly humiliated, forced to resign from her fake HOA presidency, and the entire community had turned against her. But what Margaret didn't realize was that her worst nightmare wasn't the angry neighbors, it was the law. See, when Susan called the city to verify that Margaret's HOA was fake, she wasn't the only one. Multiple neighbors had reported her for fraudulent fines, fake citations, and even financial scams. And since Margaret had been running the scheme for years, there was plenty for the city to investigate. Which is how, on a freezing Monday morning, I found myself sipping coffee in my front yard, watching as 2 government vehicles and a police car pulled up to Margaret's house. It was glorious. Margaret burst out her front door like a bat out of hell, robe flapping, slippers barely hanging on. Her face was a mess of panic and rage as she stormed down the steps to meet them. I did nothing wrong, she shrieked before anyone even spoke. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman in a navy coat, held up a fat stack of documents. Ma'am, we have multiple reports of fraudulent activity under your name. Margaret froze. That's ridiculous, she stammered, eyes darting to the cop standing behind the investigator. You can't just accuse me of crimes based on a bunch of complaints. The investigator raised an eyebrow. Actually, we can. And we did. And after looking into your records, we found some concerning discrepancies. Margaret's face went gray. See, while Margaret was busy playing dictator, she had made a crucial mistake. She had been collecting real money from people under the guise of HOA dues for years. The new families in the neighborhood, the elderly couple a few streets over, some of them had been paying her dues for months, even years. And because she was so convinced she was untouchable, she never bothered to cover her tracks. Meaning the investigators found everything. Bank transfers, handwritten logs of payments, even a spreadsheet where she had carefully tracked who paid and who owed more. She had essentially been running an illegal tax operation in the middle of suburbia. And now, she was caught. Margaret's hand started shaking. I was just collecting. Money you weren't legally allowed to collect. The investigator cut in, her voice ice cold. Which means you may be looking at fraud, wire fraud, and potentially. She flipped through the documents, then met Margaret's eyes. Tax evasion. I nearly dropped my coffee. Tax evasion? Oh, this was so much better than I had ever dreamed. Margaret's entire body locked up. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No, this is a mistake. This is a misunderstanding. The cop stepped forward. Then I'm sure you won't mind coming down to the station to answer some questions. And that's when Margaret lost it. She spun around, pointing at me. It's him. He started this. This is his fault. I raised an eyebrow. Me? Margaret, I just wanted to build a snowman. She screamed. The investigators ignored her meltdown and started seizing her financial records, loading up evidence into their cars while she continued flailing and ranting. At some point, she must have realized how deep in trouble she was, because she suddenly changed tactics. "I can pay it back," she blurted, her voice desperate. "I can refund everyone." The investigator didn't even look up. "That's not how this works, ma'am." Margaret's breath hitched. But I didn't mean." "Tell that to the judge," the cop muttered. And just like that, Margaret's house of cards collapsed. They didn't arrest her on the spot. No, this was bigger than that. They had more digging to do, more paperwork to file. But she knew. She knew she was finished. And that night, the for sale sign went up in her yard. She was running. But it was too late, because the city wasn't done with her. Margaret was a fighter. I had to give her that. Most people, when faced with mounting legal trouble, a full-blown fraud investigation, and an entire neighborhood that now openly hated them, would have quietly packed up and disappeared. But Margaret? She doubled down. After the investigators left, she went into overdrive. The very next day, a moving company showed up at her house, but they weren't taking stuff out. They were bringing stuff in: new furniture, new appliances, boxes and boxes of what looked like paperwork and legal documents. She wasn't running. She was digging in. Margaret was planning to fight this. And if she couldn't win, she was going to make the entire neighborhood miserable on her way down. The first sign of trouble came when my neighbor Susan called me over to her house. She was standing in her driveway, arms crossed, holding a letter. I didn't even have to ask. "Let me guess," I said. "Margaret." She handed it to me. "Dear homeowner, as per HOA regulations, all property owners must submit a full legal record of their lot ownership to the HOA office for review. Failure to comply will result in immediate fines and property reassessment." I laughed out loud. She's still pretending to run an HOA? Susan nodded. "Not just that. She's sending new fines to everyone who reported her." I felt my eye twitch. "She's retaliating." Susan smirked. "Oh, honey, you haven't seen the best part." She led me to the sidewalk in front of her house, and there, taped to the street lamp, was a brand new sign. "HOA regulations will be enforced starting immediately. No exceptions." I stared at it, then back at Susan. She grinned. "Margaret printed out 30 of these and put them all over the neighborhood this morning." I took a slow, deep breath. "Okay," I said. "That's it. She wants war. She's getting a war." That night, I put a plan into action. First, I gathered every single fake fine, HOA notice, and ridiculous letter Margaret had ever sent. I made copies and compiled them into a massive file. Then, I sent an email to the lead investigator on her case. Subject: additional evidence of fraudulent HOA activity. By the next morning, Margaret had a brand new set of government officials knocking on her door. But I wasn't done. While she was busy trying to explain why she was still impersonating an HOA president, I gathered a small army of neighbors: Mike, Susan, and at least a dozen others, and together, we went on a sign removal spree. Every single one of her fake HOA regulation notices, torn down, shredded, burned. Every fake fine she had taped to doors, gone. By the time she finally emerged from her house, the entire street had been purged of her nonsense. She lost her mind. She came storming down the street, red-faced and screaming. Who did this? Mike, ever the diplomat, stepped forward with a giant trash bag full of her destroyed notices. "Oh, you mean these?" he said, holding up a handful of crumpled papers. "Yeah, we got rid of them. Since, you know, they're fraudulent." Margaret's eye twitched. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "This is harassment." "I'll sue." Susan giggled. "Sue us with what money, Margaret?" "Your HOA fees." That was when Margaret snapped. "I'm taking all of you to court," she bellowed. "I'll bankrupt this neighborhood." That's when the cops showed up again. Margaret froze mid-rant as the same two officers from before stepped out of the cruiser. Officer Mitchell looked at her with pure exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said, "are you really doing this again?" Margaret opened and closed her mouth like a malfunctioning robot. They destroyed my property," she blurted. Mitchell sighed. "You mean the fake notices? The ones impersonating a legal entity? The ones we already told you to stop distributing?" Margaret went silent. Daniels, the second officer, flipped open a clipboard. "Ma'am, we have an official cease and desist order for you regarding the distribution of fraudulent legal documents." Margaret paled. "A cease and desist?" Daniels nodded. If you continue to impersonate an HOA, distribute false fines, or harass residents with legal threats, you will be charged with further counts of fraud. Margaret wobbled. But, Mitchell gave her a tired look. We're already investigating you for financial crimes, ma'am. Do you really want to add another charge? And that was the final straw. Margaret collapsed into silence. She took the cease and desist papers with trembling hands and staggered back to her house. She knew she had lost. And within 24 hours, every single one of her fake HOA documents was gone. She didn't come outside for days. The neighborhood? We celebrated. Mike even threw a block party. And in the center of it all, my undefeated snowman, standing tall, unmovable, the last monument to Margaret's downfall. But it wasn't over yet. Because while Margaret had lost the battle, she was about to lose everything. For the next 2 weeks, Margaret barely left her house. Gone was the woman who used to patrol the neighborhood like some self-appointed dictator. No more fake fines, no more HOA notices, no more condescending lectures about community regulations. The once proud HOA president had vanished. But that didn't mean her problems had. Because while Margaret was hiding, the city was working overtime to put together a case against her. And when the final bombshell dropped, it was glorious. It started on a Thursday morning. I was outside shoveling my driveway when I noticed something odd. A fleet of vehicles was pulling onto Margaret Street. Not just 1 or 2, but 6. 3 were government-marked cars. 1 was a police cruiser, and the last 2? Bank representatives. Oh, this was big. I immediately dropped my shovel and pulled out my phone. Within minutes, the entire neighborhood was outside, watching. Margaret's front door opened slightly. She must have seen the officials, because the moment she recognized them, she tried to slam it shut again. Didn't work. The cop stepped forward, knocking loudly. "Ma'am, open up. We have a legal order to discuss with you." No answer. Then, a voice from one of the government agents. "Ma'am, we have an eviction order." The air froze. Margaret's door flew open. "What?" she shrieked. "You can't. This is my house." The lead investigator stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've concluded our investigation into your finances. As it turns out, you have multiple unpaid debts tied to fraudulent HOA collections. The city has determined that," she glanced at her papers, "you owe tens of thousands of dollars in illegally obtained funds, unpaid taxes, and legal penalties." Margaret staggered. But, the investigator ignored her and continued. "Additionally, the bank has foreclosed on your home due to non-payment of your mortgage. You are hereby being forcibly evicted. You have 30 minutes to vacate." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Margaret's face went through every stage of grief at once. Denial. "This is a mistake." Anger. "I'll sue you all." Bargaining. "I can fix this, just give me more time." Depression. "I just need a minute." And finally, acceptance. She looked out at all of us. Not one person spoke up for her. Not one person offered to help. Because after years of her nonsense, after all the fake fines, the threats, the harassment, the scams, nobody felt sorry for her. And I just stood there, sipping my coffee, watching as justice unfolded. The actual eviction was a mess. Margaret had nothing packed. She had clearly assumed she could fight this in court or drag it out with legal loopholes. But she had no more tricks left. So, we all watched as officials entered her house and started removing her belongings. Furniture, papers, clothes. They piled it onto the front lawn while Margaret stood there, silent and shaking. By the time the tow truck arrived to seize her broken SUV, she looked like a ghost. And then, the moving truck pulled up, not to help her move, but to take away her remaining possessions for auction. I swear, I saw a single tear roll down her cheek. Then, finally, the lead investigator handed her one last envelope. "This," she said, "is your official notice of removal. If you return to this property after today, you will be trespassing." Margaret's fingers shook as she took it. Then, without another word, she walked to the sidewalk. Just her, no car, no belongings, nothing left. And in the final poetic moment, she had to walk past my snowman one last time, still standing, unmoving, undefeated. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked away. And as she disappeared down the street, a quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Mike turned to me, smirking. "You should build her a farewell snowman." I grinned. Oh, don't worry. I already have plans for next winter. And just like that, Margaret was gone. Her house was put up for auction, the fake HOA was dead, and peace, finally, returned to the neighborhood. That winter, my snowman lasted until March, stronger than ever, just like our neighborhood. And every year since, I've built another one. Bigger, taller, stronger. Because now, it's a tradition, a monument to the winter Margaret lost. And every time I see it, I remember, you don't have to fight every battle. You just have to outlast your enemies. And sometimes, all it takes is a reinforced snowman. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.